For the past 3 years, our weekly middle school meetings, Biff, Kim, Patrick, and I, begin with some kind of personal story. I could regale you with Biff stories tonight. But this is a great opportunity for me to make up for the many times I have reveled in giving Biff a hard time about some aspect of who he is. Tonight is all above board, and there's a long list of great stuff to tell you about. Biff brings a great deal to LMS every day. His extensive experience at all levels of Montessori pedagogy, his wisdom about child development, his passion for finding approaches and lessons and curricula that serve children's learning, his gentle friendliness, his unstoppable optimism and positive spirit, his broad and infectious humor. Up until last June, he also brought his son Teddy. We are all grateful for that especially. Biff became all this through doing lots of things, among them growing up with 4 siblings. He was a boarding student at the Lawrenceville School for High School, spent a year in England through the English-speaking union at St. Bees. He came back to the United States to attend Duke University. Yes, that's another thing he brings to LMS every day, fanatical support of every Duke athletic team. There is a game tonight, you know. And it's at 9 o'clock. So you know you will get home. Right, Duke University, where he earned a BA in psychology, in Cincinnati at Xavier University, studied and earned a whole lot of credentials, an MA in education, Montessori credential for lower elementary, and a Montessori credential for 3 to 6. He went back overseas to Bergamo, Italy, where he received advanced Montessori training and another credential to teach 6 to 12-year-olds, not to mention becoming fluent in Italian. He will be giving his speech in English as far as I know, however. Biff has served on the board of the American Montessori Society. He, I believe, has presented at every national AMS conference for the past 1,000 years, not to mention has been training Montessori teachers since before Maria Montessori was born. Biff has made 37 years of his life about educating children. When you meet just about anyone involved in Montessori education, ask if they know Biff, and they usually do. Don't go to an American Montessori conference with him, though, however, because you walk everywhere and they, oh, Biff, 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 and you're just like this little person that just doesn't exist. All this so that he could bring all that great stuff to LMS every day. This fall, we will all celebrate Biff's 25 years at Lexington Montessori School. When he came in 1986, he started the upper elementary here. Mind you, the building we are in right now did not exist, and the 9 to 12 classroom was in the children's house. Now he is our director of yes, I can never actually say what you are now, Director of Faculty and Curriculum Development, DOFCADA, affectionately known. But we will save his LMS history for next year. Thank you, Biff, for speaking to us tonight.
I have to say it's really gratifying that you guys are here on a Saturday night to hear me explain why your tuition investment is a wise one. But really to try to answer the question, what makes this quaint pedagogy modern? Of course, one way to keep a century-old pedagogy current is to continually self-evaluate. LMS does this systematically every year, but for the past 3 years, we have been self-evaluation on steroids. As we have completed accreditation first for the Association of Independent Schools of New England, and we did all of those things, so there's this comprehensive review of the entire school, and then we just couldn't stop, so the next year we jumped through the hoops for the American Montessori Society, and the American Montessori Society had 2 different aspects to their accreditation process. The first one was all this stuff, proving that we were Montessori enough. And the second part is the one that I want to talk to you a little bit about tonight, because this part asked us to look at the results of our work. It asked us to look at the kids that are in the school and see whether we can actually see evidence in their behavior that we're accomplishing the things that are really most important to us. So I want to tell you what those things are that are most important to us, and hopefully they are also the things that are most important to you. The first thing that AMS asked us to talk about or look for is independence, which means do we see kids choosing work, doing that work with industry, succeeding at that work, and then putting their work away? Do we see kids correcting their work, looking for what went wrong, and then how to fix it? Do we see kids looking for support from the things that they find on the shelves, from each other, and from their teachers, their guides? The second one had to do with confidence and competence. Do we see kids knowingly succeeding at what they're doing, meaning establishing pride in their successes? Do we see them boldly self-correcting their work, using what they see, what they think about, and what they discuss with their friends to correct their work? And do we see them developing a sense of purpose and intention? The third one has to do with autonomy, and autonomy is distinct in this respect from independence because it has to do with being in charge of yourself instead of just not needing help. So for autonomy, do we see our students making informed and uncoerced decisions? Do we see kids taking responsibility for their actions? The next one is intrinsic motivation. Are our students eager to work because they like to work? Are they spontaneously sharing what they're learning and sharing their expertise with their peers? Then social responsibility. Do they collaborate and cooperate and negotiate with their friends? Are they bold enough to express themselves? Do they defend their opinions? Of course, there's also academic preparation. Are they showing learning that is comparable to what they would be learning in our peer schools? Are they developing the kind of organizational skills that they need in order to succeed? Are they aware of what they're good at and what they're not so good at, and how to use the things that they're good at to leverage against the things that challenge them? This one has a little bit of poetic license because AMS uses the term spiritual development, and I changed it to psychic awareness because I think what they really mean by that is, are they aware of reaching benchmarks that tell them that they are growing up? Do they derive meaning from the context of their studies? Do they remain aware of how individual contributions contribute to whole systems? And then the tip of this tower is global citizenship. Do they embrace our multicultural curriculum and our multicultural approach? In their attitude toward the natural world, do they cherish it, respect it, sustain it, and aim to live harmoniously in it? And then finally, do we see evolving civic virtue? So those are the things that are most important to us. Those are the things that we looked for last year and wrote about and then had people come and observe our school and give us feedback on. Sometimes we take all this stuff for granted because really this is the culture of LMS. It's kind of the medium of values that we swim in. But our approach is distinctive, considering, especially if you consider the climate of education generally in the United States today. Many of the forward-looking leaders in education, but actually also in business, are speaking out about a mismatch between conventional schooling and the world that our children are growing up in. Ken Robinson is an internationally known leader in the field of creativity, innovation, and human potential. He credits our imagination for taking us from caves to cities and from marshes to the moon. But he worries that we may have plateaued imagination-wise. At this point in human evolution, we need a new level of innovation. And he says there's a danger that our imaginations actually might be failing us. We've seen far, but not far enough. We still think too narrowly and too closely about ourselves as individuals and ourselves even as a species, but not enough about the consequences of our actions. Tony Wagner is an Innovation Education Fellow at the Technology and Entrepreneurship Center at Harvard. He's the author of the Global Achievement Gap, and he worries that increasingly there is only one curriculum in American public schools today: test prep. Teaching for the sake of succeeding on state and national standardized tests, he says, is becoming an epidemic, one that is infecting our students. Indeed, the most significant impact of No Child Left Behind, and I would say also the Race to the Top, may be its contribution to the growing gap between what is being taught in even our very best schools and what today's students will need to succeed and be productive citizens in the 21st century. This is what he calls the global achievement gap. The problem is conventional schools were designed to prepare a population for a factory economy. We remain preoccupied with analysis and with reasoning, and we have a hierarchy of subjects. We put math, basic reading and writing, and science at the top. Humanities slips down to the middle, and the arts comes in last. We talk about differentiation in the educational world. We talk about integrating things. Those are our buzzwords. But really, most teachers have to work within very strict limits about how they teach and how their students learn. The irony, says Robinson, is that in the 21st century, jobs and competitiveness depend absolutely on the qualities that most schools discourage. And this is the part that I'm really fond of. Robinson says, the kind of education that we need in the 21st century builds on the principles that have been promoted for generations by educational visionaries like Maier Montessori. Principles often seen as eccentric, even heretical, and they were when she was doing her work. But the views of these visionaries were ahead of their times. The time has now arrived, and the stakes could not be higher. Robinson says it's time to change metaphors. We have to move beyond linear, mechanistic metaphors to more organic metaphors of human growth and development. Once again, Montessori was way ahead of it. In 1950, she used this graphic to explain her theory of developmental psychology, with alternately colored triangles illustrating stages of development. 1 year later, right near the end of her life, she revised the graphic because she wanted to make it look more organic, more fluid, more alive. And she explained that existing education is the result of regarding education from the point of view of society and social organization rather than from the point of view of physical and psychological needs of human growth and development. So Ken Robinson again, he says, this is about looking into the eyes of your children, and rather than approaching them with a template of who they might be, trying to understand who they really are. It's difficult to feel accomplished when you're not accomplishing something that matters to you. Doing something for your own good is rarely for your own good if it causes you to be less than who you really are. Today's learning visionaries argue that we're squandering a lot of talent with our narrow and quantitative view of intelligence. Gardner at Harvard, Sternberg, formerly at Yale, and Tufts, now in Oklahoma, and Robert Cooper at Stanford, all talk about different types of intelligence. And what they're really saying is that they want to shift the question from how intelligent are you to how are you intelligent. It's about discovering yourself, and you can't do this if you're trapped in a compulsion to conform. You cannot be yourself in a swarm. So I'm sure that most of you have seen this, but this is a better illustration of Montessori fish. It's from the New Yorker. Ken Robinson reminds us that the key to transformation in education is not to standardize it. It's to personalize it, to build achievement on discovering the individual talents of each child, and to put students in an environment where they want to learn and where they naturally discover their own passions. There are three processes in education. There's curriculum, there's pedagogy, and there's assessment. Most educators put most of their energy in curriculum development and assessment. But the real difference maker is pedagogy. In a recent Boston Globe article, Pasi Sahlberg wrote in an article called Learning from Finland, he described how Finnish schools have gone from fairly poorly regarded 10 years ago to now the envy of the world, according to the Program for International Student Assessment. He explains that their reform methods are diametrically opposite to the reform methods in the United States. Here are some of the differences. There are three basic differences. The first one is that Finnish kids don't take standardized tests, and they never use standardized tests to compare teachers or to compare schools. The second is that the teachers in Finland are autonomous professionals, and they play a key role in the curriculum planning and all of the assessment of the students. So the key, obviously, is to find talented teachers and give them all the professional development they need, and then trust them to do the work. And then the third difference is that educational leaders and superintendents in Finland are all former teachers. This, of course, describes most Montessori schools. It certainly describes Lexington Montessori School, but it doesn't describe most conventional schools in the United States. Robinson explains that public schools were not only created in the interests of industrialism, they were created in the image of industrialism. There's a woman named Elizabeth Ross Hubble who is a former Montessori teacher, and she is now a learning technology consultant. She offers this contrast between the characteristics of the industrial age and the characteristics of the information age. I don't know whether you can read that with that font is big enough, but if you look at that, you can see, if you could see it, you would see that the characteristics on the right-hand side that describe information age are much closer to the Montessori program and to Lexington Montessori School's program than the descriptions on the left side, the industrial age, which still characterize most of our schools. Montessori asked teachers to connect with cultural change. She asked, what purpose would education serve in our days unless it helped humans to a knowledge of the environment in which they have to adapt themselves? So Tony Wagner, in the Global Achievement Gap, explains it this way. There are three basic skills that students need if they want to thrive in a knowledge economy or in the information age. The first one is that they have to be able to do critical thinking and problem solving. The second is that they have to have the ability to communicate effectively. And the third is they have to have the ability to collaborate. So really, it comes down to thinking. The Foundation for Critical Thinking says everybody thinks. It's our nature to do that. The problem is that much of our thinking left to itself is biased, distorted, partial, uninformed, or downright prejudiced. Yet the quality of our life and what we produce, what we make, what we build, depends on the quality of our thinking. Shoddy thinking is costly in money and in the quality of life. So what is critical thinking? Critical thinking involves raising vital questions and problems and formulating them clearly and precisely. It also involves gathering and assessing relevant information and interpreting it effectively with well-reasoned conclusions that are tested against relevant criteria. It involves thinking open-mindedly, assessing assumptions, implications, and consequences. And finally, it involves communicating effectively with other people to figure out solutions to problems. So what critical thinking is not is acquiring and retaining information, possessing specific skills, and using those skills as an exercise. Which is not to say that those things aren't important, but they aren't the most important. So Widener says thinking and 21st century learning really is all about asking questions. Montessori told us to cultivate curiosity. She said, the secret of good teaching is to regard the child's intelligence as a fertile field in which seeds may be sown to grow under the heat of the flaming imagination. It's helpful, I think, to contrast left brain operations and right brain operations. Left-brainedness includes critical thinking and problem solving and accessing and evaluating data. We have to be able to do these things, and I'm going to show you some of the ways that Montessori program at Lexington Montessori School is good at building these abilities. But Daniel Pink, the author of Drive, also wrote a book called A Whole New Mind, Why Right-Brainers Will Rule the Future. He's good at titles. Right-brainedness includes curiosity, imagination, and creativity. When we're learning a concept, the more memory pathways we construct, the better our recall is. Our Montessori students build memories with movements, and with rituals, and with color codes, and with patterns. There are many ways of learning, and our goal is to offer support for all of them. The iconic golden beads give a physical experience of size, weight, and geometry associated with numerical hierarchy, and they require moving back and forth across the room. The matching numerals introduce young children to the color coding system that they will then use throughout their math experience. When they move to the stamp game, they're using the color coding, but they've now lost the weight difference in the hierarchy. So they depend on one of the coding systems. When they start using bead frames, the beads use the color coding systems, and then they're reminded of the geometry with the hierarchical material. And then I have this oldie but goodie, because I think it's cute. It gives you an idea of the size of that hierarchical material, and also the difference in size between the Teddy of the old days and the Teddy of today. The checkerboard, of course, also employs the same color coding system, as do the test tubes that we use for teaching division. When we move to decimal fractions, we use the same color coding system. The only difference now is that we're using parts of units instead of multiples of units. You can do the same thing, of course, with the checkerboard, as long as you take away part of the color and make it lighter. And then you can also be analytical instead of synthetic, and you can take apart numbers by extracting square roots using the same color coding system. So I want to tell you also about a particular component of the Montessori curriculum, because I think it shows how content is embedded in the pedagogy. Ken Robinson wrote, "The power of human creativity is obvious everywhere. In the technologies we use, in the buildings we inhabit, the clothes we wear, the movies we watch. Through imagination, we can visit the past, we can contemplate the present, and we can anticipate the future, and we can create." At Lexington Montessori School, we structure informational learning around really big questions. In fact, we impose this particular lens on the exploration of cultures. We ask, what do all people need to stay alive? There are fundamental needs that we all have. Once we are familiar with those needs, we can make sense of any people from any place, from any time. We can, on the one hand, recognize the commonalities that we share because we have the same challenges. And on the other hand, we can delight in the unique ways that they meet those challenges. The structure allows us to hold similarities and differences in our minds at the same time. It allows us to truly embrace diversity. So quickly, these fundamental needs that we share include our need for nourishment, housing, clothing, transport, and defense. Once these things are satisfied, we can then become aware of some needs that we have for our spirit. and because our material needs have been met. So in our spiritual needs, we are expressed through the arts, through our searches for meaning, and through our need to beautify ourselves and our things. So very quickly, let me show you a quick comparison of similarities and differences as recently investigated by middle schoolers who were heading for Puerto Rico. So if you take that same thing and you put it on a sort of mind map, you get on the right-hand side all the questions that have to do with material needs, and on the left-hand side you get those spiritual needs. So if you look at the Spanish in the 1500s, the people that arrived in the Caribbean ate rice dishes like paella. They lived in urban settings. They wore chain mail and armor. They arrived in galleons. They were used to powerful walled fortifications. They played the lute. They imposed their religion on other people using the Inquisition. And they put fancy fabrics over wire frames. That's an entire culture. When they arrived, they found the Taíno. If we ask the same question about the Taíno, they ate bread and soups that were made from the tuberous roots of the cassava. They housed themselves in bojil, which were small circular homes. They were basically naked. They traveled in dugout canoes. They didn't have much for defense because they didn't defend themselves, although they did have bows and arrows. They made petroglyphs and ceremonial sculptures. They had ceremonies which involved purging with special sticks that they used to shove down their throats and throw up. They danced and they feasted. And they beautified themselves with body painting and with ceremonial sculptures. So we're asking exactly the same questions, and we're interested in the differences so that we, on the one hand, can see how people all share the same drives, and we impose that structure in order to get kids to think about similarities and differences simultaneously. This same strategy is used not just in comparing cultures, but even in biology. These organisms all need to hold themselves, anchor themselves somewhere. And so these things do it in different ways, whether it's a mushroom holding itself in the soil with mycelia, or whether it's a pine tree holding itself with a root system. They have different systems. So the question, how does it anchor itself, is the same for all of them. The strategies vary. This is a child's response to the story that our lower elementary teachers tell about the origins of the universe. So I want to go back to the power of questions. There are two parts to Montessori's secret of good teaching. One was having the attitude that a child's mind is fertile. And the second one is appealing to their imagination to nourish their learning. We call this impressionistic teaching, seeking to strike a student's imagination to leave a memorable image or other experience that they can draw on to recall the root of the concept. Robinson says that growth comes through analogy, through seeing how things connect, not only seeing how things are different. So, this is a picture of charcoal. Imagine if you went back 40,000 years. When humans made their very first marks on a rock wall, that's probably what they used to do it. The very first written expression, really old. This is an Egyptian pyramid, also pretty old, 5,000 years old, and it's in pretty good shape. 5,000 years of winds and storms and looters, and that shape has withstood it all. We merge these two symbols to make a black pyramid, and we use this to represent the oldest and the most basic words, nouns. People proudly first named the stuff around them. Babies still start with the names of the stuff that is important to them. Names persist. They are resistant to change. We simplify the pyramid to a black triangle that carries these impressions or those stories with it. Have you ever tried to change, for example, Aline's name? If you've read This Week at LMS, there's a noun. If you were to change that to Eileen, it doesn't work, and she wrote quite articulately about that this week. Have you ever known anybody that has tried to change their name and it's been their choice? You know, most of us say, okay, to everybody else that's fine, but to me you're still Biff, right? Well, maybe I'm just the only one that's stubborn. So I have, I need a volunteer. Would you be a volunteer? I'm going to put something up here in a second. And when I do, when I do, just outside that door on the bench, there's something that I'd like you to get for me. But we're going to do this entirely silently, just with the message that's up here. Okay? Did I do? Okay, so can you go get that? Just outside the door. I hope. Oh, I'm sorry, it looks like you've got a bunch. See, it says the paper. It doesn't actually say the papers. So if you could just bring... Actually, I wasn't clear. Because what I really said here is the paper, which means there was only one that I really was interested in. And you've actually brought me not the one that I was looking for. So hang on. This word might help. It's the biggest one you could find out there?
Doesn't say biggest. Doesn't say biggest. It says big.
Fine! So what I wanted to do is, as soon as you showed up with the big one, I was going to make it a little one. And then when you brought the little one, I was going to make it the long one. You're such a smartass. Thank you. It's exactly how it works out in the classroom, too. That's why your children come home and they say, what is a smartass? So, the paper was the name. The told you there was only one that I was interested in. And then that word is the one that directed you to the correct one. So notice that the name didn't change. The specificity didn't change. But what did change is the description, and that's an adjective. So that's one of the ways that we would get through the impression of the power of an adjective. And then we turn it into a little family. I'll give you another one. The sun is the symbol that we use for the verb because everything depends on the energy of the sun in the same way that in a sentence, all of the energy depends on the energy of the verb. One could say that everything is predicated on the verb. So we change the image of the sun to something that we actually can find in the classroom, so we can talk about it like a red ball. And then we make that flat so that the symbol for the sun or for the verb becomes a red circle. And then we can name the action, and the nouns that are associated with that action, the actor or the object, revolve around that like planets. So for example, if we had wrote as our action and Ida as our actor, and what did Ida write? She wrote a novel. Shameless plug. And we end up with the planets revolving around the verb. And I have one more, just because I love it. The father in this story is the noun. And the father is stable, secure, unchanging, dependable. And there's a teenage son. Notice he's a bit taller than the father. He thinks he doesn't need his father's identity anymore. He thinks he's completely independent. He can stand on his own. But actually notice that his base is a little bit narrower and a little less stable. And actually, the pronoun must always remember the identity of the antecedent. So I call this story, Who's Your Daddy? This is all of the symbols. They all have their stories. They all have their impressions. And when you put them together, you could create a sentence like this one. And then you could symbolize it. So you can see the patterns. And this whole strategy is not something that I came up with. It's not something that we came up with at Lexington Montessori School. You may remember from the very first slide that the Doctoressa herself did this work. That's Maria doing grammar. Here's another example. This is something that came from the training program in New York that I work in. It's an imaginative way to introduce human biology. The allegory is of a great nation built on a great river. The river obviously being the circulatory system, and the citizens of this nation work tirelessly and loyally always for the benefit of the nation as a whole. This is a detail of that nation where the citizens are tirelessly and loyally working to clean the impurities out of the blood. Another way that we encourage critical thinking around a concept is to ask, what's the history of this question? Who's asked this question before, and what did they think? So one such big question might be, where did the moon come from? So if we look at the Egyptians, their mythology held that Horus's left eye was the moon. His right eye, incidentally, was the sun. In northern Germany, the Norse mythology shows that wolves were pursuing Sol, which was the sun, and Mani, the moon, across the sky. So that was their explanation. And nowadays we tell the story of a proto-Earth colliding with Theia, which is another planet rotating on roughly the same orbit until they collided. And when they collided in this massive explosion, the result was Earth and its moon. So exploring various other approaches to big questions is one of the ways that we breathe life into the process. Another one is to personalize everything. We encourage creative thinking by stressing that it's actually people that invent things. There's a human interest angle to every discovery and to every development. Who was this Pythagoras, the man behind the theorem? And why is it that he thought that numbers held all the mysteries of the universe? And why is it that he insisted that his students put their right sandal on before their left sandal? Of course, stories like this remind kids that someday people may say, who was this Sergey Brin, or some other Montessori student? Every October, LMS celebrates Halloween by inviting inventors, authors, characters of books, and other historic people to visit and tell their story for Mystery History Day. Another way to foster critical thinking is to encourage looking at concepts from another angle. And one way we do this is by blurring the disciplines. This is a playful and interdisciplinary way to practice the nomenclature of triangles. Apparently there's a guilty triangle somewhere in that box. I have a clue that says scalene, so I can eliminate all of the isosceles and all of the equilateral triangles. Pretty powerful adjective. One stroke and I've eliminated 2/3 of the suspects. These are constructive triangles. By exploring equivalent figures, children have realized that it's not just squares that are built on the sides of right triangles where you can combine the two on the legs and they equal the one on the hypotenuse. It works for equilateral triangles too. It also works for hexagons. This year we're working on all sorts of ways of integrating the arts and movement and Spanish and more into our classrooms because we know this whole child approach enhances the understanding and retention of information and it promotes divergent thinking. Creative thinking involves the ability to generate new ideas and also the flexible attitude that accepts that change and also that accepts risk. I think we're starting to figure out some of the best ways to develop these abilities and these attitudes, but we do already know what many of the obstacles are. There are obstacles in ability, which come about because of formulaic, shallow curricula and assessment. These include bias, oversimplification, snap judgments, short-sightedness, and wishful thinking. There also are obstacles in attitude, the aversion to change and risk. They all come from being afraid of failing, from being afraid of ending up outside the box, of being different. So these come from disconnected, unimaginative pedagogy, being afraid of the problem, assuming that it can't be done, or you can't do it, or you're not creative, something like that. One of the most important outcomes of the work that we do here is to help students know themselves authentically as students, as social beings, and as creators. Daniel Pink says that right-brained people will rule the world because they find joy in themselves and they elicit it in others. They know themselves well enough to create a position that fits their profile. They customize their world to fit their self-awareness. Pink declares, authenticity pays. What do other people think? Another reason right-brainers rule, according to Pink, is that they understand what he calls high touch. They understand the subtleties of human interaction. What we need are people that have thinking skills and emotional intelligence, the ability to think and collaborate. Collaboration allows us to accomplish learning that we couldn't do alone. It challenges the teacher to go from being a deliverer of material to being a designer and a facilitator of experiences. Given that definition from Pink, it's not surprising that he identifies Montessori schools as the schools of the future, which use what he calls Motivation 3.0. In most schools, teachers worry that they could never find enough time to talk with kids, except during lunch or maybe recess. Our continuous dialogue helps students see us as colleagues in learning, and it allows us to coach social emotional skills as well as academics. For Lexington Montessori School kids, it begins with scenes like this: Manasa and Corinna reading together in the library. And it moves on to parallel explorations and more parallel explorations, and the collaborations gradually become more interactive, and the kids use their collective knowledge, and they solve problems together. Here's another really good goodie. We build communities of writers and readers where they learn that their understanding of literature is richer when they have multiple perspectives, where they listen to the advice of their peers and they listen to the advice of their peer writers to improve their craft, from 6 to 9 and in 9 to 12. Our classrooms are learning communities, and when we have problems, we take them to the learning community, whether it's an advisor group or whether it's a community meeting. And kids have learned the strategies for solving problems, defining it, brainstorming solutions, selecting a solution, and evaluating the decision of the solution and making changes if necessary. We're good at helping kids ask probing questions about literature, evolution, and multiculturalism. We're getting better at incorporating open-ended, collaborative inquiry into the sciences too, and into math. For the past couple of years, the upper elementary kids have committed an afternoon every week in the fall to hike, explore, observe, and map sections of the Western Greenway, which is a corridor of conservation land that encompasses parts of Lexington, Belmont, and Waltham. Last year, this open-ended project produced a field guide that was posted on the Waltham Land Trust website. This year, the students surveyed the land to identify healthy and unhealthy streams, and they submitted the data that they collected to a conservation assistant from the town of Lexington. Upper elementary kids continue to culminate science units with projects in which they explore an aspect of their study and they create an expo of installations that teach what they've learned. Last year I did a project called Destination Imagination with lower L kids, in which I gave them very little stuff, very few things, and then I gave them a challenge, and I was astounded by their resourcefulness and their inventiveness in approaching those challenges. Collaboration and its companion, socialization, take time. Of course, we never feel like we have enough time, but we know that the more we tighten the scheduling, the less autonomy kids have, and the less productivity, the less real learning we get. There's an inverse relationship between external control and autonomous productivity. In research that was published last week, Duke psychologist Terry Moffat reported the results of a long-term study showing that self-control is the secret to success, and that the best way to learn self-control is to be taught and to focus specifically on increasing self-control. Mary Fort Hayes is the president of the Massachusetts Association of Curriculum and Development. She recently recently returned from a study of Finnish schools, and she said, the single best feature of the Finnish system is the freedom of choice that students have. What to take, when to take it, and with whom. Students confirm this. One of the challenges, of course, of so much freedom and flexibility is guiding students to make good choices. The best way to construct emotional intelligence is to use it, and to model it, and to discuss it. The hardest thing for our kids to understand about conventional schools, including standardized tests, is why they can't work together. This is Chris Opie. Chris is a senior at Arlington High School, and he spent most of last summer rescuing penguins in South Africa. He wrote, in his college application, he wrote an essay about the disagreements that he had with his teachers after he left Lexington and went to Arlington, I guess it was middle school. And in that he said, I came from a school with no grades, a school in which sharing homework and tests and ideas was expected, not frowned on. I still carry with me the ingrained thought that knowledge is the end goal of a course, not the grade. To me, the real measure of my performance lies in my own understanding. I'd take that kid. The famous philosopher and scientist Michael Polanyi said, free and open exchange of ideas is the vital pulse of scientific inquiry. Einstein's collaborator John Wheeler said, if you don't kick things around with people, you're out of it. Nobody can be anybody without somebody being around. Freeman Dyson said, it's only by interacting with other people that you get anything interesting done. Students learn so much from manipulating materials together. Different ways of approaching and solving a problem, different styles and standards of performance. There's no better way to cement understanding than to explain it to somebody else. Kids speak often communicates difficult concepts much more effectively than we do. If we want to encourage creative, divergent thinking, we have to provide learning environments that foster and encourage interactions and autonomy. This is the headquarters of Google in California. Notice its open, flexible space. Then compare that to the LMS classrooms that you know so well, and notice that the classrooms are open. They encourage spontaneity and interaction and divergence. Our century-old Montessori method is actually quite the modern way to help children prepare themselves for going forth. And with all these traits, think of the places they go. Many of you have met or at least heard from our elder graduates. They are an impressive lot. They are truly global citizens. They are people of character, commitment, and purpose. Their happy success is the best possible indication that our 100-year-old method prepares our graduates well for the modern world.